Michael, I want to start by asking you, you've done training for a long time and advised clients on how to do good training. And then you also were kind enough to do some training with me and with our new approach through the Purple Method. I'd love for you to just share a little bit about, where you've seen traditional compliance-oriented approaches fall short and how organizations can do better on that front.
Thanks, Allie. It's nice to be with you all today. And I wouldn't say that you've been lucky to have me work with you. It's sort of really been the opposite. We've learned a lot. I've learned a lot, and I've learned a lot that I've tried to convey to my colleagues and some of my clients who are open to it. That I've learned in working on trainings with you. The question you pose is sort of what are some of the limitations on trainings that are compliance oriented? And I come from a background where, as I worked as a lawyer, both in-house and as an outside lawyer over the years, compliance was always sort of a top level goal of a lot of what we did when I counseled my clients. In the training arena, I liken focusing on compliance to be sort of like focusing on like the bottom layers of Maslow's pyramid, right? I mean, we're talking about basic needs, and when compliance is the focus on something as kind of multi-layered and impactful on an organization and its employees and other communities, as sexual harassment, sexual violence, other types of harassment, by setting your goal at the basic needs part of the pyramid, you're missing, not to torture the metaphor, but you're missing, the aim towards self-actualization. You're for your organization. You're missing sort of the full value that training can have. Sub-bullet point for that, right, is that when training is compliance oriented in direction, it doesn't really bring the organization together. It gives you the baselines, it sets some parameters. Those are important. They become more important if you can do what Rob was talking about and be very specific about what some of those rules are. But even if that part of compliance is well done, it does very little to bring organizations together. A lot of compliance trainings, I think, Allie, you may have been surprised when I told you this at one point, a lot of the trainings I have done over the years have been separate sessions for managers and non-managers. We literally did different trainings for those different groups. And so the message that's being delivered by that being the case is that these are different camps. Different rules apply, different standards apply, and we're not letting anybody talk to each other about just what this means for our organization. So I think that when you're doing more compliance-oriented training, especially if it's being kind of compartmentalized, even by separating groups, that sends the opposite message of what it means to show why an organization is doing something, especially now, because you will hear in connection with almost any compliance training you do. I've even had this be part of introductions to me in doing training. As you know, New York now requires that we do this training, or California requires we do this training. And so here's our outside vendor, and he's, we paid him $5,000 and he's going to, throw up some slides for the next hour. It's leading people to feel as isolated and alone as they maybe felt before the training, right? I mean, yes, we're telling them now, this is where you report. These are some things you can look out for. But for people who could really contribute to the organization on these important issues, I don't think by doing compliance-oriented training, we're really encouraging those discussions to happen. You'll even see, while if you do a compliance-oriented training with, say, my law firm, you're going to get prettier slides and you're going to get some better examples. The fact is, compliance-oriented training is really starting to become, as we're becoming more enlightened, we're also seeing that there's a race to use what, say, the government publishes. One of the first things anyone hands me when they're new to this and they want us to help them train is they'll hand me the New York Model compliance training, which is done by the New York Department of Labor and the Human Rights Division, State Human Rights Division, and it's a compliance training, which is important, but it doesn't move you. It doesn't move you really forward. I'll use it as a transition to introduce Dallas, who really in the trainings that she and Ali have developed and have implemented are really doing the opposite. So we can talk more about sort of the positive side of what training can do.
Thanks so much, Michael. So obviously there's a ton of ways that companies can approach training, even as they work to become certified with the Purple campaign. The Purple method approaches it in a specific way, and that's what I'm going to talk to y'all about. So we work to make sure that our trainings have a certain set of features that we believe deliver better outcomes. The first one is that they're interactive and engaging, right? So we've all been to HR trainings where you're just like, great, when is this over? We really want to avoid that feeling. We want folks to really feel like this is something that relates to their jobs, and that they can actually get something out of it. The other thing that I think is really important is that these are evidence and research-based trainings. So we look at all of the research that's out there on how folks respond to different methods of training and different approaches, and we apply that to how we approach folks in our training. They're also legally compliant in all 50 states. And like Michael mentioned, in New York City, which has its own very specific requirements. And maybe most importantly, they're custom tailored to individual workplaces. So what are each individual workplace's values and policies? Because we focus in on this wanting to ground the training into the work that folks do that brings them to the office every day, right? And we do that because research shows that a lot of people come into a harassment training seeing, I think understandably so, seeing themselves neither as a potential victim nor a potential perpetrator. And so it's easy for them to think to themselves, this doesn't really apply to me. But if you connect it back to the work that they're doing and you ground the training back to that, then it applies to them because you're talking about this work that they're committed to. So we're in grounding it back to that work. It's how do we get all folks to listen, including those who don't really see themselves in that training in any way. Part of what makes the training so engaging, like I mentioned earlier, is that we design hypotheticals specific to the people that we're training. So for instance, if we're training a venture capital firm in San Francisco, we might tailor our dating hypothetical to be about, can you ask somebody who is an employee of a portfolio company out on a date, right? And that is a slightly different scenario than just, can you ask somebody who works in a cubicle over out on a date? But that's a very real scenario that's covered in that company's policy and that we want to make sure that we cover. So again, everything in the training is really designed to tailor back to and point at the work that they do every day and connect with that company's values. So to that end, we want to make sure that we address all the gray areas. Because as Rob said, folks are always going to interpret any gray areas to their own benefit. So let's make sure that we talk in our trainings about implicit bias, about relationship policies, about alcohol use, about compliments in the workplace, physical touch, and what are our workspace norms? Like what can you display in your work, in your cubicle, or now in your Zoom background? We always want to make sure that we approach employees as bystanders and allies, recognizing that we want to bring all folks to the table, and never approach folks as potential perpetrators, because we, again, know there's research that if you approach people as potential perpetrators, there can actually be a backlash against the protected classes that you're actually hoping to improve their work environment. Lastly, it's been super critical to pivot and ensure that we are at Purple Method, that the trainings are applicable to what employees are facing now in our virtual environment. So hugging at work is probably less of a concern right now, but harassment over Slack or other messaging platforms might be more of a concern. So just because we've gone virtual does not mean that harassment has disappeared. And so we've pivoted our trainings to make it very applicable to the online environment. So all of that said, we want to give you a little sneak peek of a hypothetical.
So the question that we're sort of sending you into the break to contemplate from a Purple Method training. The hypothetical is your coworker compliments the painting on the wall behind you after a Zoom meeting. Later, over Slack, they ask whether the roommate they saw walk by is your significant other. The next day, they come to you, they say to you, they like the top you're wearing and that they wished they could see the whole outfit. I'd say the question would be, is this a problem, and at what stage or stages is it a problem?